Say the words, or I sign your sister into Lord Vessel's keeping by Mike Elmer's, and you know what manner of keeping he offers a girl of no fortune." The words fell into the cold vestry of St. Aldwyn's chapel like stones into a well, and Brannock, Duke of Ivelden, standing unremarked in the shadow of the doorway with the rain still darkening the shoulders of a borrowed and threadbare coat, heard them and did not move. He had come north on a matter of drainage and a disputed weir, of all the mean and grinding things a man might come to a country parish for, and he had stepped inside only to be out of the wet while the wheelwright mended a cracked axle on the road. He had not expected to find a woman being sold at the foot of the altar. He had certainly not expected to be mistaken for the article of purchase. "Mother," the younger woman's voice did not rise, and that was the first thing he marked about her, for in his experience women pressed to the wall either wept or shrieked, and both were tiresome. This one only stood very straight in a gown that had been turned and re-hemmed so many times the seams had gone pale, her gloved hands folded before her, as though she were at prayer and not at auction. "You may threaten Prudence all you like. It does not make me a salable thing." "It makes you an obedient one," said the mother, a stout, glittering creature in plum silk that strained at every seam, her fingers heavy with rings that Brannock, who knew the price of stones the way other men knew the price of corn, judged to be paste. "Ungrateful girl. I have found you a husband. That the husband is a beggar off the London road is your doing and no one else's, for you would not have Sir Marcus, you would not have the tallow chandler's son, you would have no one who might have raised this family from its ditch. So I have found you the one man in the Shire who will take you for nothing, and by heaven you will have him, and you will be off my accounts, and Prudence will be free to marry where the money is." So that was the shape of it. Brannock leaned his shoulder against the cold stone and watched, and understood, in the way he had learned to understand a room in the half-second before he entered it, that he was the beggar off the London road. He glanced down at himself, at the coat he had bought from a carter for £1 that morning, because his own was soaked through and he had wanted, God help him, one single day of walking a road where no one bowed, and he understood that he had been mistaken for a vagrant. It had happened before, in the last 3 days, more than once. He had found it restful. He had not, until this moment, found it useful. The clergyman, a nervous stick of a man with ink on his cuff, cleared his throat and looked between them. "Mrs. Durrant, I cannot marry your daughter to a man who is not present." "Ah, the intended party. He is present." Mrs. Durrant's small eyes swung across the vestry and fastened, with the unerring instinct of the desperate, upon the only stranger in it. "There, that one. Come you here, fellow, you're the man Cobb sent, are you not? The one wanting a roof and a wife and no questions. You look the part well enough, all rags and long looks. Come here and marry my daughter, and there's a crown in it for you and a bed in Cobb's barn to boot." Every head turned. Brannock, Duke of Ivelden, before whom the great families of 3 counties rose when he entered a room, before whom ministers of the crown moderated their voices, found himself examined by a room full of country people as one might examine a horse of doubtful wind. He was aware that he ought to speak. He was aware precisely of the sentence that would end this. "I am Ivelden, madam, and you will unharm this girl." It sat ready on his tongue. 6 years of guarding every door of himself had made such sentences quick. He did not say it. He would ask himself afterward, many times in the small hours when the fire had sunk to embers and he could not account for the man he had become between one breath and the next, why he had not said it. The truest answer was the one he liked least, that his eye had gone back to the girl, and that the girl was looking at her mother with an expression he had not seen on a human face in a very long time. Not fear, not fury. A kind of terrible, quiet weighing, as of someone doing hard arithmetic and finding the sum unbearable, and beneath it, threaded through it, a fierce and hidden tenderness that had a name at the end of it, and the name was Prudence. She loved her sister. She would ruin herself to shield her sister. Brannock had spent 6 years believing such a thing did not exist out of ballads sung by people who wanted your money. "I will need," he said, and his own voice surprised him, roughened deliberately, the ducal edges filed off it, to speak with the young lady first. Alone. A man may look at what he's asked to take on. Mrs. Durrant's face worked between offence and calculation, as it always did in such faces. 1, 2 minutes, she snapped. Reverend, we'll wait without. And you, fellow, mind you don't run off with the church plate. She swept out in a rustle of straining plum, herding the anxious clergyman before her, and the vestry door thudded shut, and the Duke of Eildon was alone with the woman he had, apparently, been summoned to marry. For a moment neither spoke. Rain ticked against the one high window. She had turned to face him fully now, and he saw that she was younger than the set of her shoulders had suggested. 3 or 24, no more, with a plain, grave, unfashionable face that ought to have been unremarkable and somehow was not. For there was a light of intelligence behind the grey eyes that made a man feel weighed and measured, and unaccountably wish to measure well. You needn't, she said. Needn't what? Pity me. It sits badly on you. You're not a man accustomed to it, I think, whatever those rags say. She tilted her head, studying him with that same disconcerting directness. You held that coat closed at the throat just now the way a gentleman holds a coat he is ashamed to be seen in, not the way a poor man holds the only coat he owns. And your boots are wrong. He looked down before he could stop himself. The boots were indeed wrong, good English leather, a London last, mud-caked but unmistakable to an eye that knew leather. He looked up again to find her watching him with the ghost of something that was not quite a smile. I am not going to marry you, she went on gently before he could assemble a lie, whoever you are. I only said what I said to buy an hour, because my mother in a temper signs things, and I did not want her signing Prudence anywhere before I could get my sister out a window and onto the mail coach to our aunt in Harrogate. So you may keep your crown and your bed in Cobb's barn, and you may go back to whatever you are running from. I know the look of a man running, I have worn it myself, and I thank you for the 2 minutes. They are worth more to me than you can know. Brannock, Duke of Eildon, had negotiated the marriage settlements of an archduke's cousin. He had faced down a mob at his own gates in the hunger year and turned it with nothing but the flat of his voice. He stood now in a country vestry and could not, for the space of several heartbeats, find a single word. He realized, staring, and he was a man who did not stare, a man who had trained his eyes for 6 years to slide off faces before those faces could catch and hold him. He made himself look at the high grey window instead, at the rain crawling down the glass, and he set about the business of retreat. 2 minutes. He would let the 2 minutes run their course, and he would say nothing further of himself, and when the mother returned he would demur, plead a change of heart, and be gone up the London road with his mended axle and his own affairs, and this parish and this girl would close over behind him like water. That was the sensible course. That was the only course. He had come north to be no one. He could not now afford to be someone in the eyes of a woman clever enough to price his boots, and yet he did not retreat. He found, instead, that he wanted to know how the sum came out. How a girl so quick and so unfooled had arrived at the arithmetic of her own worthlessness, and who had taught it to her, and whether she truly believed it or only wore the belief the way she wore the twice-turned gown, because it was what she had been given and there was nothing else to hand. Your aunt in Harrogate, he said at last. She will take you both? She will take Prudence. The grey eyes did not waver, but something in the plain face closed quietly, like a door drawn to against the cold. There is not room nor bread for 2. And Prudence is 17 and pretty and has her whole life to spoil. I am neither, and mine is largely spent already, so I am the one who stays behind and manages my mother. It is arithmetic, sir. I am rather good at it. It is the only thing I was ever good at. That, he said slowly, is a lie. She blinked. It was, he saw with a strange satisfaction, the first time he had knocked her off her stride. You said your name is arithmetic, he pressed, and he was aware he had stepped closer, aware of the cold and the rain smell and the extraordinary stillness that had come over the little room. You are good at arithmetic, but you have miscounted one figure, madam, and I wonder that a woman so precise should miss it. You have counted yourself as nothing, a thing to be sold, a thing to be left behind, a spoiled life. And you did the sum in front of a stranger without once looking to him to correct it, which means you believe it. That is not arithmetic. That is a wound someone taught you to call a number. The silence that followed was so complete he could hear his own pulse. Her mouth opened, closed. For one moment the grave composure cracked, and beneath it he glimpsed something raw and unguarded and very young, and he understood, with the same instinct that read a room, that priced a stone at a glance, that no one had said such a thing to this woman in the whole of her life, and that she did not in the least know what to do with it. Neither, God knew, did he. He had not meant to say it. He, who measured every sentence, who had learned in the worst year of his life that a single unguarded word could be turned into a knife and driven home, he had spilled that out onto the flagstones like a man appending his own pockets. Because 6 years ago there had been a woman who had wept prettily and looked at him with adoring eyes and told him he was the finest man in England, and he had believed her, and she had married his dearest friend 3 weeks after Brannock signed over the mortgage that saved her father. And Brannock had learned, standing at the back of another church very like this one, that a face that flatters you is a face that is picking your pocket. He had gone north into himself after that. He had made of his own heart a locked and shuttered house and thrown the key into the deep. He had crossed half of England these 3 days in a carter's coat precisely so that no one would look at him with that adoring, calculating light. And here, in a parish he could not have found on a map a week ago, stood a woman who had looked at him and seen a fraud in good boots, and named him a runaway and refused his hand and flattered him not at all, and had somehow in under 2 minutes said more true things to him than the whole of London had said in a year. "Who are you?" she asked, very low. "A man who came in out of the rain," he said, which was true, and which was the first wholly honest sentence he had spoken to anyone in longer than he cared to reckon. "That is not an answer." "No," he agreed. "It is not," and he found, to his own alarm, that he was smiling, not the thin diplomatic thing he wore at dinners, but something that pulled at muscles long unused. "Miss Durrant, before your mother returns and sells me the church plate along with your hand, tell me your Christian name. I find I do not want to leave this room not knowing it." She hesitated, rain ticked. Somewhere beyond the door her mother's voice rose and fell in complaint. "Calantha," she said. "It means beautiful flower," which was my mother's single joke at my expense and her last kindness in the same breath, for I have been neither beautiful nor cherished since. A wry, unwilling twist of the lips. "You may laugh. Everyone does, eventually." "I am not laughing," Brannock said, and he was not. The door burst open. Mrs. Durrant stood upon the threshold in a wash of grey daylight, the clergyman wringing his hands behind her, and behind them both a slight, frightened, lovely girl of 17 who could only be Prudence. And the little vestry that had held, for 2 minutes, the strangest and truest conversation of the Duke's life, filled up again with the world. "Well?" Mrs. Durrant demanded. "Have you looked your fill, beggar? Will you have her, or shall I put her out to service and be done?" "I will have her." The words came out of him level and certain, and they astonished no one in that room half so much as they astonished the man who spoke them. Calantha's head turned sharply. He did not look at her. He looked at the mother, and he let something of Ivelden come back into his spine. Just enough. Just the flat, unhurried authority that made men in far grander rooms fall silent, and he watched Mrs. Durrant's triumph curdle by degrees into unease as she began too late to wonder what manner of beggar spoke so. "On my terms," he went on. "I will marry your daughter within the week at this altar, and I will take her off your accounts entire, and I will trouble you for nothing, not a crown, not a settlement, not so much as a wedding breakfast. In return you will trouble her for nothing ever again. You will not write to her. You will not come to her door, and you will let the younger one, Prudence, go to her aunt in Harrogate with a clean name and no debt hung about her neck. Those are the terms. Refuse them, and I walk back into the rain, and you may explain to Cobb and to the whole of this parish how you stood a girl at the altar and could not even give her away." The vestry had gone utterly still. The clergyman's mouth hung open. Mrs. Durrant looked at the ragged stranger with the London boots and the sudden iron in his voice, and Brannock saw the greed war with the fear in her, and saw the greed lose, and knew he had her. "Done," she breathed. He turned then at last to Calantha Durrant, who was staring at him white to the lips, her careful arithmetic scattered across the floor of the world, every figure of it overturned. She had bought an hour to save her sister. She had not, he thought, the faintest notion what she had actually purchased, and neither, in full honesty, did he. He knew only that he had come north a locked house of a man, and that a woman in a twice-turned gown had said things to him in a cold room, and that he would sooner have set his hand to the deed on half the north again than walk back into the rain and never learn what she might say to him tomorrow. "You are mad," Calantha said faintly, for his ears alone. "Very possibly," the Duke of Ivelden agreed. "We shall have a whole marriage in which to determine it," and he offered her his arm, good boots, borrowed coat and all, and after a long, wondering moment, in front of her disbelieving mother and the gaping parson and the wet grey window, she took it. The chapel had emptied of everyone but its echoes by the time Brannock offered his new wife his arm, and he found, to his own quiet astonishment, that his hand was not entirely steady. He had stood before cannon without so much as a tightening of the jaw. He had faced down men who wished him dead and outlasted them by the simple expedient of caring less than they did. Yet here, in a plain northern chapel that smelled of tallow and cold stone, with a ring of tin upon the finger of a woman he had met scarcely a fortnight past, something in him had come loose from its moorings, and he did not know its name. She took his arm without hesitation and without display. That was the thing he could not account for. A woman marrying a pauper before the whole of her mother's disapproval ought, he thought, to have flinched, or wept, or arranged her features into some brave and public suffering. Calantha Durrant, Calantha Brannock now, though the word sat strange in his skull, did none of these. She simply rested her gloved hand upon his sleeve, as though he were a matter settled, and turned her steady grey eyes toward the door where her mother waited with a face like a shut ledger. "Come, Mr. Brannock," she said low enough that only he might hear it. "Let us give her nothing further to feed upon. She dines on my discomfort. I have decided she shall go hungry." He nearly smiled. He had spent the better part of 2 decades teaching his mouth not to betray him, and this slip of a woman, in a single sentence spoken over the ruin of her prospects, had very nearly undone the lesson. He mastered it. But he marked her words, and he marked the manner of them. No bitterness in the voice, only a dry and level courage, the sort that did not announce itself, because it had never once been asked to. Mrs. Durrant was waiting upon the flagstones outside, and she did not trouble to lower her voice at all. "Well," the woman said, drawing her furs about her as though the July air had personally insulted her, "you have had your way, Calantha, and much joy may it bring you. A ditch-born nobody with mud on his only boots. I hope you will remember, when you are darning his stockings by a single candle, that Lord Merrow would have given you a house in the Crescent and a barouche of your own." "I shall remember it," Calantha said. "As I shall remember that Lord Merrow required a wife the way a man requires a good hunter, for the appearance she makes when he rides her out, and for very little else." Brannock kept his eyes upon the middle distance and said nothing, as a poor man ought to say nothing while his betters quarrelled over his worth. But behind the flat mask he wore for the world, he was listening with the whole of his attention, the way he might listen to a scout returned from difficult country. He had come north in these plain clothes for reasons he had confessed to no living soul, chief among them the wish to stand once in his life outside the great and gilded machinery of his name and see what manner of person addressed the man rather than the Duke. He had expected flattery or scorn or the naked calculation he had seen upon 100 faces since he was old enough to inherit. He had not expected this. He had not expected to be defended. For she was defending him in her oblique way, without ever once glancing toward him for permission or reward. It was not done for his benefit. That was the marvel of it. She would have said the same into an empty room. A carriage was brought round, not his of course, for the Duke of Ivelden's carriages did not come north wearing his arms while he wandered the district in a labourer's coat, but a hired thing, close and unlovely, the best that a penniless bridegroom might be supposed to command. He had arranged it himself, through 3 intermediaries, so that not a soul in the county might trace the money to its source. He handed Calantha up into it. Her mother did not embrace her. Her mother, in point of fact, had already turned toward her own fine equipage, and the last Brannock saw of the woman was the stiff retreating column of her back, and it occurred to him, with a coldness that surprised him, that he would enjoy very much watching that back bend one day. The carriage lurched forward over the ruts of the chapel lane, and then they were alone together for the first time as man and wife, hemmed in by worn leather and the smell of old horse, with the moors opening grey and gold on either hand. He had thought there would be tears now, in the privacy of it, where no mother watched. There were none. Calantha drew off her gloves, finger by finger, and folded them in her lap, and looked out at the passing heather with an expression he could not read, not sorrow, not triumph, only a kind of grave attention, as though she were taking careful stock of the life she had just chosen and meant to make an honest inventory of it. "You are wondering," she said at last, not turning from the window, "whether you have married a lunatic." "I confess the thought had crossed my mind," Brannock said. He pitched his voice as he had trained it these 3 weeks, plainer than his own, the vowels of a man who had never had a tutor, though he let a little dryness remain, for he found he could not entirely surrender it in her company. "A woman does not commonly refuse a house in the Crescent for a man with, as your mother so kindly noted, mud upon his only boots." At that she did turn, and she looked at him fully, and he felt the look go through the disguise as though it were gauze, though of course it did not, for she saw only what he had dressed himself to be. Still, the sensation was disquieting. No one had looked at him so directly in years. People looked at the title. They looked at the estates, at the fortune, at the 12,000 acres and the coal beneath them and the harbour that half the north shipped its wool through. They arranged their faces before his the way courtiers arrange themselves before a throne. This woman looked at him as though he were a man sitting across from her in a bad carriage, which was, so far as she knew, exactly what he was. "I did not refuse the Crescent for you, Mr. Brannock," she said, and there was no cruelty in it, only a scrupulous honesty that he was coming to understand was simply her nature. "I will not begin our acquaintance by flattering you, for flattery is a coin I have watched be counterfeited all my life, and I have no wish to pass bad money to a man I must live beside. I refused the Crescent because Lord Merrow is a cruel man wearing the manners of a kind one, and my mother knew it, and offered me to him regardless, because his rents are 5,000 a year. I chose you because you were the one door out of that house that did not require me to become a thing I despise. That is the whole of it. It is not romance. I would not insult you with a lie so soon." Brannock was silent for a long moment, and the reason he was silent was that he did not trust his voice. He had come into this district a suspicious man. He would have called it prudence. His late steward had called it once, to his face, a wound that Brannock had chosen never to let heal. 15 years past there had been a woman, Seraphine, all candlelight and quick laughter, who had wept upon his shoulder about the smallness of her heart's true wishes, and whom he had loved with the whole reckless faith of a young man not yet taught otherwise. He had overheard her, 3 nights before the wedding, laughing with her sister behind a screen at a ball, tallying his income to the pound and wondering aloud whether she might, once she was Duchess, contrive to see him gone to some agreeable war. He had said nothing. He had let the banns run their course in his mind and then, in the cold light of morning, ended it with a letter of 2 lines and never explained himself to a soul. From that day he had known, with the certainty of a man who has touched a hot iron, that his name was a lantern that drew every moth in England, and that no woman living would ever be able to tell him whether it was the man she warmed to or the light. So he had done a mad thing. He had put off the light entirely and come north as a pauper to see. And here, on the very first afternoon of the experiment, sat a woman who had just told him, without being asked, and at some cost to her own comfort, precisely why she did not love him. Because to let him imagine otherwise would have been a lie, and she would not stoop to it even to soothe a stranger's pride. It was, he thought, the most extraordinary thing anyone had ever said to him. "You are very honest," he managed. "I am very poor," she corrected him with the ghost of something that was almost humour. "Honesty is the one luxury poverty leaves a woman. No one can take it from me, because no one thinks it worth the stealing." She looked down at the tin ring upon her finger, turned it once, and looked up again. "You need not fear me, Mr. Brannock. I asked nothing of you at the altar but your name, such as it is, and a roof, such as it may be. I shall keep your house and mend your linen, and I shall not reproach you for what you have not got. In return I ask only that you never lie to me. I have been lied to my whole life, most of all by those who claim to love me best. I find I would rather have a hard truth from you than a soft falsehood from anyone else in England. Never lie to me." The words landed in him like a stone dropped into a deep well, and he felt them go down, and he waited a long time for the sound of them striking bottom. He was at that very moment the largest lie she had ever been told. He was a falsehood in every stitch of the coat upon his back, in the roughened voice he had schooled, in the hired carriage and the tin ring, and the whole elaborate architecture of his poverty. He owned half the North. He owned the very turnpike this carriage jolted upon. The tolls of it fell into his coffers 4 times a year, and she had just asked him, with the plainest trust he had ever been shown, for the one thing he could not possibly give. "I will not lie to you," he said, and heard, appalled, how much he meant it, and how completely he was lying even as he swore it. She nodded, satisfied, as though a small and reasonable contract had been agreed, and turned back to the window. And he sat watching the clean line of her profile against the grey glass, the plain brown hair coming a little loose at the temple, the chapped and capable hands folded in a lap that had never known a lady's maid, and he found that he could not look away from her, and that the inability alarmed him more than any threat he had faced in 15 guarded years. They came, toward evening, to the cottage he had taken under his false name at the far edge of a village called Thornlow, 2 rooms and a scullery, honestly poor, for he had refused to soften the disguise with any comfort that might give the game away. He had wondered, taking it, what a gently reared woman would make of such a place, and he had prepared himself for the small collapse of the face, the swallowed disappointment, the brave dishonest cheer. Calantha stepped down into the mud without waiting for his hand, looked at the low door and the smoking chimney and the single crooked window, and said, "It faces east. We shall have the morning sun in the kitchen." My grandmother had a cottage that faced west, and she said a west-facing kitchen was a slow murder, dark all morning when you want the light, and blinding all evening when you want your rest. This is better. It was not what a woman said who was pretending. He knew the sound of pretending. He had lived inside the sound of it for years, had learned to detect the hollow ring of it the way a money changer detects a shaved coin by its weight in the palm. This had no hollow in it. She had genuinely, in the space of a breath, found the one good thing about a poor cottage and taken honest pleasure in it, and it undid him more thoroughly than tears could have done. He thought, unbidden, of the women who peopled the world he had left behind, of Odalys Larkspur above all, whom he had watched only a month past at a gathering in the county town, arranging herself beneath a window so that the light might fall becomingly upon her throat, laughing her practised silver laugh at every jest a titled man let fall and none that a poor one did. Miss Larkspur could not have crossed the threshold of this cottage without her face performing its dismay for an audience that did not exist. She would have found the one flaw and displayed it, as another woman displays a jewel. Calantha had found the one mercy and said nothing of it beyond a housewife's brisk approval, and the difference between the 2 women seemed to Brannock, standing in the smoke of that mean little room, the whole difference between a painting of a fire and a fire itself. Within the hour she had the fire drawing that had defeated the last 3 tenants, had found the flaw in the flue with her own suited fingers and packed it with a wad of wet clay, and had set a pot of the plain provisions he had laid into something that filled the 2 mean rooms with a smell that Brannock, who dined ordinarily upon the labours of a French cook he paid £300 a year, discovered he was helplessly grateful for. She did it all without complaint and without performance, humming some tuneless country thing under her breath, and once, reaching past him for the salt, she laid her hand briefly upon his shoulder to steady herself, and the small warm weight of it stayed printed on him long after she had moved away. It was in that unguarded moment that the disguise very nearly cracked, for a boy came to the door as the light failed, a farrier's lad from the village, cap in hand, with a message that a horse had come lame at the crossroads inn and its rider was asking after the man who was said to have a rare hand with hunters, for the whole district had somehow gotten wind that the new fellow at Thornlow, poor as he was, knew horses the way a bishop knows scripture. It was a small thing, but Brannock had risen and given the boy swift instructions in a voice that had, for the length of a sentence, forgotten to be poor, the flat unanswerable voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed by grooms and generals alike, and he had seen the boy's eyes widen. And he had seen worse, Calantha go still at the hearth, the wooden spoon arrested in her hand. She said nothing. That was the thing that struck him as the boy scampered off into the dusk. A lesser woman would have asked. A scheming one would have pounced upon the discrepancy and turned it over for its worth. Calantha only looked at him for a moment across the firelit room, her grey eyes gone thoughtful and unhurried, taking in something that did not fit. The boots beneath the borrowed rags that were too fine for any pauper, perhaps, or the hands too unmarked by labour, or that single lordly sentence still hanging in the smoky air between them. She saw that he was not entirely what he claimed. He was certain of it now. He watched the knowledge arrive in her and settle, and then deliberately, with a courtesy so complete it was nearly a kindness, she chose not to pursue it. She turned back to the pot and stirred it once and said only, "Your supper will spoil if you stand there gathering flies, Mr. Brannock," and left him his secret as though it were a coat she had noticed did not fit but was too well-bred to remark upon. He sat down slowly at the crooked table. Across the low room she moved in the firelight, humming again, ladling out a poor meal with the unhurried grace of a woman entirely at peace with what she had chosen, and Brannock, Duke of Ivelden, master of 12,000 acres, feared from the coalfields to the coast, understood with a sinking and exhilarated dread that he was in a very great deal of trouble, and that he could no more stop watching her than he could have stopped the turning of the earth beneath the wheels of that homeward carriage. The invitation to the Larkspur's assembly came edged in gilt, and Brannock knew the moment he saw it laid upon the breakfast table that had not been sent in kindness. Odalys Larkspur did not extend her hand to those beneath her without expecting the pleasure of watching them stumble. The card named Calantha, and beneath her name it named her husband only as her husband, without so much as the courtesy of a Mr., as though the man she had chosen were a thing appended to her, a debt she carried into every fine room she was permitted to enter. He watched Calantha read it. He watched her set it down with those steady hands that had, only a fortnight past, spoken vows over him in a chapel so plain the plaster wept damp in the corners, and he saw that she understood precisely what was being offered her. "You need not go," he said. "I was raised not to flinch," she answered. "If I refuse, they will say I hid. If I go, they will say a great many things, but they will say them to my face, and I find I prefer that." He had married a stranger to spare her a worse marriage, and he had told himself it would be a matter of ledgers and distance, two lives arranged not to touch. He had not accounted for this, the plain sense of her, the way she reasoned as a man of affairs might reason, weighing not what she wanted but what could be borne. He inclined his head as though it were nothing to him whether she went or stayed. It was not nothing. He had ceased, some days ago, to be able to make it nothing. The Larkspur house sat 2 valleys south, a great northern pile of blackened stone that had been built to be seen from the road and to make the traveller feel small. Brannock knew it well, though no one in it now would know him. He had walked its halls in another coat and another name, in the years before he had learned to trust no smile that arrived the instant his rank was spoken. He wore the poor man's clothes he had chosen for himself, the frayed cuff, the boots honestly worn. And he gave the footman at the door the name of a nobody, and the footman's lip curled, and Brannock felt, absurdly, that he was more at ease inside that curl of contempt than he had been in a decade of beaux. They came into the long saloon together, and the room performed the small cruelty it had gathered to perform. Conversation did not cease. It thinned and turned the way water turns when something has been dropped into it. Odalys Larkspur crossed the floor to meet them in a gown the colour of claret, her hair dressed high, her smile arranged with the care of a woman who has practised it before glass. "Calantha," she said, taking both her hands as if in warmth, holding them out to the side the better to display the modest muslin, the gloves mended at one seam. "How brave you are, I do so admire it. I could never wear a thing twice and hold my chin as you hold yours. It must be a great freedom to have given up on the good opinion of the room." "I have not given it up," Calantha said. "I have only stopped purchasing it. It proved dearer than it was worth." A little silence opened. One of the young women at Odalys's shoulder, a Miss Verrall, all ribbons and appetite for sport, gave a laugh that she smothered too late. Odalys's smile did not falter, but Brannock, who had spent his life reading the faces of people who wanted something from him, saw the flick of temper behind her eyes, quick as a fish turning under ice. She recovered as her kind always recovered, by widening the circle of the sport. She summoned 2 more to her, a pink-faced gentleman named Culpeck who laughed before he understood the joke, and a thin lady in grey who had the look of a person kept about only to agree, and she guided Calantha the length of the saloon as though showing a curiosity to friends. At each little knot of guests she paused to make the same offering, dressed each time in fresh solicitude. Was it not touching that a girl should marry so far beneath the hopes her poor mother had held? Was it not a lesson to them all how little a woman truly needed when she had ceased to expect anything? And each time the guests smiled the thin smiles of people glad the blade was pointed elsewhere, and each time Calantha bore it as a war bears rein, upright and unhurried, giving the water nowhere to gather. Brannock walked in their wake and said nothing, and the saying of nothing cost him more than any speech he had ever made in the Lords. He had built his whole guarded life upon the principle that other people's malice was no affair of his, that a man who cared for nothing could not be wounded through the things he cared for. He had believed it too, until a fortnight passed. Now he watched a threepenny ribbon quiver at the edge of a plain bonnet, as its wearer held head level under one insult after another, and he found the old principle had rotted through in the night and would no longer bear his weight. And this, Odalis said, turning the full battery upon him now, sweeping him from worn boot to frayed cuff with the leisure of a woman appraising a horse she has already decided not to buy, is the fortunate gentleman we have heard so little of you, sir. Durrant's daughter married in such haste, and to such economy. Tell us, what is your trade, for you must have one. A wife cannot be kept on air, though I dare say some have tried. He felt the old cold thing wake in him, the thing that in his own house would have ended a conversation, and with it a career. He kept it leashed. I keep accounts, he said. It was in its way, the truest thing he had said all week. He kept accounts of 100 farms and 4,000 acres and the rents of half the north, and he had never once in 20 years enjoyed the keeping of them as he enjoyed now the exquisite blankness with which Odalis received the answer. Accounts, she repeated, as one might repeat the name of a disease. How useful. I have found it so, he said. She had wanted him to shrink, and he had declined to shrink, and because she could not reach him she turned back to the softer mark. That was the way of her kind. He had watched it 100 times across 100 dinners, the cruelty that flowed always downhill, seeking the lowest ground. She drew Calantha by the arm toward the card tables where the older women sat, the dowagers and the aunts, the arbiters, and Brannock followed a pace behind, because he could not have made his feet do otherwise. Come, you must sit with us, Odalis said, and tell my Aunt Larkspur how you manage. She is endlessly curious about economy. Aunt, here is Calantha Durrant, that was, who has married a man of accounts, and who trims her own bonnets, is it not true? I am sure I saw the very ribbon on a bonnet at the spring fair, at a stall marked at 3d. You did, Calantha said. I bought it there. I remember you were at the next stall admiring the French silk, and you did not buy it, and I have often wondered since whether it was the silk you could not afford, or only the honesty to say so. It was said without heat, in the clear even voice of a woman remarking on the weather, and it landed in the middle of the card table like a coin dropped on marble. The Aunt Larkspur, that grim monument of a woman, made a sound that might, in a person less armoured in propriety, have been a laugh. Miss Verrall went scarlet, and Odalis stood very still, and the practised smile stayed fixed upon her face while everything behind it went to winter. Brannock should have held his tongue. A poor man of accounts had no business in the affairs of his betters, and every instinct of his disguise told him to stand at the wall and be forgotten. But he saw Odalis draw breath to answer, and he knew the shape of what was coming, for he had heard it all his life. The cruelty that dresses itself as concern, the blade slid in beneath a compliment, and he found that he would not have Calantha struck again while he stood by and watched. Mrs. Larkspur, he said, and the room turned to him, astonished that the appendage had a voice. You spoke of trades. Mine has taught me one thing above all others, which I will give you without charge, since you have been so generous with your own instruction this evening. A ledger does not care what a woman wears, cares only whether she pays what she owes and keeps what she promises. By that accounting, the only honest one I know, my wife is the richest woman in this room, and I should be glad to hear who here would care to be measured against her. He had pitched his voice low, and he had not raised it, and perhaps that was why it carried. No one answered. The fire spat. Somewhere a fan clicked shut. Odalis Larkspur looked at him then as though seeing him for the first time, and something in her face groped after a memory it could not quite catch, the way one hears a bar of music and cannot name the song, and Brannock, cursing himself, turned his shoulder and let the moment close over. He had done a foolish thing. He had shown for the breadth of a sentence the man he actually was, and men who kept accounts did not speak so to Orderly's larkspur and remain unremarked. He felt Calantha's eyes upon him, and he did not dare meet them yet, and he moved instead toward the tall windows at the room's far end where the crowd thinned and the cold pressed against the glass. She found him there a quarter hour later, when the card play had resumed and the music had struck up and the room had, mercifully, forgotten them both. "That was unwise," she said, coming to stand beside him. She did not look at him. She looked out at the dark garden, at the frost silvering the box hedges under a thin moon. "It was," he agreed. "They will make you pay for it. Not tonight. Odalys does not settle her accounts at once. She lets them run and adds interest." He heard the ghost of something in her voice, not quite a smile. "You did not need to do it. I had her measure. I know you had. That is precisely why I could not bear it." The words were out before he had weighed them, and he felt the danger of them, and he did not call them back. "You stood there and let her strike at you, and you did not so much as blink, and I thought, a man may be forgiven a great deal, madam, but not the sin of admiring a thing and lifting no hand to keep it from harm." Now she did turn to him, and in the candlelight her plain face was not plain at all. It was the most direct face he had ever looked into, and it undid him a little every time she used it, as she used it now, to see straight through the coat and the frayed cuff and the borrowed name to something underneath that he had thought well hidden. "You speak strangely for a man of accounts," she said. His heart went still. "Do I? You said madam as though you had said it to a great many people and grown tired of it. And you looked at Odalys as though her rudeness were a bill you had already paid long ago, and did not care to pay again." She studied him, unhurried, unafraid. "I do not know what you were before you were poor. I have not asked, because it did not seem mine to ask. A woman who marries a stranger to escape her mother has forfeited the right to be particular about her stranger's history." A breath. "But I will say this. Whatever you were not always this." He might have laughed it off. He was practiced in the arts of deflection. He had turned aside sharper questions than hers with a shrug and a change of subject, and he had never once in 20 years felt the temptation he felt now, to set the whole edifice down, the name and the acres and the weary heart, and simply tell her. The wanting of it frightened him more than any threat Orderly's larkspur could devise. "I was a man who learned to be careful," he said at last, which was true, and which told her nothing, and which she received with a small grave nod as though she understood exactly how much a man might hide inside a true thing said carefully. "And what taught you the lesson?" He was quiet a moment. In his own house a question so direct would have gone unanswered, and the asker would have learned not to ask again. But there was no rank between them here to hide behind, only two people at a cold window, and he found the silence would not hold. "A great deal of experience," he said, "and none of it worth the price I paid for it." He looked out at the frost. "A person I trusted who valued a thing about me that was not me, who smiled at the sound of it, and grew cold when it was withheld." He had never said it aloud. He had scarcely said it to himself. He did not know why he said it now, to a woman he had married as one signs a treaty, in a saloon that hated them both. "I found I could no longer tell the smile that was for me from the smile that was for the account, so I stopped trusting smiles and began trusting silences instead," she said softly. "That is why you married me. I did not smile at you. I had nothing to smile at you for." It was so exactly the truth of it that he could not speak. She had reasoned her way to the center of him in the space of a single conversation, standing at a cold window in a house full of enemies, wearing a bonnet trimmed with a threepenny ribbon, and she had done it not to flatter him and not to flay him, but simply because she saw, and could not help seeing, and would not pretend she did not see. "You are a dangerous woman, Calantha Durrant," he said, and he meant it as it had never been meant before, half in dread and half in something that felt terribly like joy. "I am the safest woman you will ever meet," she answered, and there was no coyness in it, only that plain even certainty he was coming to lean upon. "I want nothing from you. I have made rather a discipline of wanting nothing from anyone." It is the only economy that has never failed me. She drew her mended glove straight along her wrist, a small ordinary motion, and it stopped his breath. We should go back in. If we stand here longer, they will invent a reason for it, and I have given them enough tonight. She was right, and he knew she was right, and he did not move, and neither did she. The music came muffled through the glass. Beyond it the frost went on silvering the hedges, patient and clean, indifferent to every cruelty performed in the warm rooms behind them. He thought of the years he had spent behind his own high walls, feared and flattered and profoundly alone, and he thought that he had crossed 2 valleys in a poor man's boots to stand at a stranger's window and feel, for the first time in a decade, that he was in the presence of something he could not afford to lose. "One more turn about the garden," he heard himself say, "before we go in. It is a fine night, and I find—" He stopped and gave her the whole of the truth, because he had discovered he could not give her less. "I find I am not yet ready to be finished talking with you." For a moment she did not answer, and he thought he had misjudged, had reached too far too soon. She inclined her head, that grave small nod he was already learning to wait for, and drew her shawl closer, and stepped with him toward the garden door, and Brannock, Duke of Avelden, who had ruled half the north without ever once being ruled by his own heart, understood with something close to terror how much he wanted the walk to be long. He ought to have let her go in when the others went in. That was the sensible course, and Brannock had built a life upon sensible courses, upon the cold arithmetic of what a man owed his name, and what a name owed nothing to anyone. Yet when Calantha turned toward the lit windows of the great house, her borrowed shawl drawn close against the coming chill, he heard himself say low that the east terrace kept its warmth longest after sundown, and that a person who had endured such a supper had earned a quarter-hour of quiet before facing the drawing-room again. She stopped. She looked at him with those steady grey eyes that never once, in all the evening, had measured him for what he might be worth, and she said only, "Then show me the warm stone, sir, for I have had my fill of cold ones." So he led her along the terrace, away from the music, and the reserve he had worn like armour since a spring 12 years gone felt, for the first time in memory, a size too small. The garden below lay in the blue hush of dusk, the yews black against a sky still bruised with the last of the light. Somewhere beyond the box hedge a fountain kept its patient counsel. Brannock walked a careful half-pace apart from her, hands clasped behind his back in the attitude of a man with nothing to declare, and she walked beside him with her chin lifted, not as one who performed her dignity, but as one who had simply never learned to set it down. He had watched grand women all his life arrange themselves for effect, tilt a shoulder, lower a lash, spend their beauty like coin against his fortune. He had learned to see the calculation behind every soft glance until he could no longer see anything else. It had made him feared. It had made him alone, and here was a plain woman in a made-over gown who had spent nothing on him at all, and he could not stop looking. "You are quiet," she observed, "for a man who promised me warm stone and conversation both." "I promised the stone," he said. "The conversation you must draw out of me yourself. I am told I keep it as close as a miser keeps his rents." That startled a laugh from her, quick and unguarded, gone before she quite permitted it. A poor bargain. "Though I have made worse of late." She trailed her fingers along the balustrade, and the touch left a dark track in the evening's damp. "You did a kind thing in there, when Miss Larkspur spoke of my slippers. You needn't have. It cost you standing with your own set, I think." He had done it without thought, which was itself the marvel. Odely's Larkspur, all diamonds and honey, had remarked in her carrying voice upon the mended satin of Calantha's shoes, and the little court about her had tittered on cue. And something in Brannock that he had believed long dead had risen up cold and swift, and he had said, into the hush, that he thought mended things the more honest for their mending, and that he had never trusted a woman whose slippers had never carried her anywhere worth the wear. Odely's had smiled with her mouth alone, and Calantha had looked at him then as she looked at him now, not with gratitude which he could have borne, but with a plain attention that went through the fine coat and the practised coldness to whatever was left underneath. "I have little standing to spare and less use for it," he said, "and I have no patience for cruelty dressed as wit. It is the coward's favourite costume." "You speak as one who has worn it," she said, not unkindly. I speak as one who was fitted for it young and cast it off at some cost. He surprised himself with the truth of it. He had meant to turn the remark aside with a jest, and instead it had come out whole. It is easier to be feared than known, Miss Durrant. Fear asks nothing of a man's heart. I recommend it to anyone who wishes to keep his. She was silent a moment, and the fountain filled the silence then. And has it served you? The keeping? No one had asked him that. Not his steward, not his aunt, not the procession of mothers who had steered their daughters across his ballrooms like small bright ships toward a harbour. He found he did not wish to answer it lightly, and so he did not answer it at all, but turned the question gently back to her, as one returns a lantern to guide the other's path. You escaped a worse supper than mine once, I think. You have the look of someone who has learned exactly what a smile can cost. The last light caught the side of her face. She did not flinch from the question. That was the thing he would remember. She met it as she met everything, straight on. My mother, she said, has 3 ambitions, and I am the instrument of all of them. My father left us with a good name and no money to feed it, which is the cruelest thing a name can do. It keeps you at the table and takes away your dinner. Since I was 17, she has arranged me before every man of means within 40 miles. Like a length of cloth, she means to sell before it frays. Sir Hollis Marchmain was to be the buyer this season. Her mouth twisted, not quite a smile. You will have heard of him. I have heard nothing to his credit. There is nothing to hear. He is 60 and buries wives the way other men change horses, for the freshness of the next. His last was 19 and is a year in the ground. My mother called it a triumph. She had the settlement drawn before I had met him twice. She drew the shore closer, and Brannock felt the old cold thing in him turn over, no longer aimed at Odalys Larkspur, but at a woman he had never met and already despised. I told her I would not. She told me I had no choice, that a girl of my station and my portion, which is to say none, could not afford a conscience. And she was right, you understand. That is the part I could not forgive. She was entirely right, and she said it as though it were a kindness. So you made a choice she had not foreseen, he said very quietly, for he thought he saw it now, the shape of the thing that had brought a gently born woman to a modest chapel and a stranger's arm. I married a man with nothing. She lifted her chin higher, daring him to laugh, and he had never in his life been further from laughing. A man of no fortune and no name to speak of, so that no fortune could be made of me. My mother cannot sell a bride already given. She cannot barter a woman another man has taken to wife, however poor he be. I gave up the good marriage she wanted so that I might keep the one thing she had never thought to price. Her voice did not break. That was the wonder of her. It held level as a hand that has carried the same weight for years and knows precisely how. Myself. I kept myself. It is not much, sir, when you set it beside diamonds. But it is mine, and I chose it, and no woman in that drawing-room can say the same of anything she owns. Brannock stood very still. The music had grown faint behind them, and the first stars had come out cold and clean above the yews, and he understood with a clarity that frightened him that he was in the gravest danger he had known since he was a young fool of 28, who had believed a beautiful woman when she wept. Because he knew the man she had married. He had put on plain broadcloth and a borrowed name and gone out from his own gates 12 years soured, certain that no creature under heaven would ever want the man if the man were stripped of the duke. He had told himself it was an experiment, a bitter little proof he owed his own contempt. He had not told himself the truth, which was that he was so starved for one honest face that he had disguised his very self to go and find it, and he had found it. She stood beside him in the dark, mending her own slippers and refusing to weep, calling him a man of no fortune, and she had chosen him, chosen the nothing, chosen the beggar over a title and a settlement, every comfort her mother had spread before her. She had chosen him for being poor. And he was the richest man in the north. The wrongness of it sat in his chest like a swallowed coal. Every honest fibre he had left cried out that he should tell her now, tonight, on this terrace, before the tenderness in him grew past uprooting. But she had just said, in that level, unbreakable voice, that the one thing she owned was a choice freely made, and if he spoke now the choice would dissolve in her hands like sugar in rain. She would not have chosen the Duke. She would have been chosen by him, which was the very fate she had married a pauper to escape. To give her the truth would be to take from her the single possession she had bled to keep. And there was the smaller, meaner voice beneath the noble one, the frightened voice he liked least of all himself, that whispered, "If you tell her, you will never again be certain. You will watch her face change, and you will never know whether it changed for you or for the half of England you own." "You are looking at me," Calantha said, "as though I had confessed to a crime." "No." His own voice came rough. "As though you had confessed to a courage I did not think survived in the world. Most people, given the choice between comfort and themselves, sell themselves and call it prudence. I have watched them do it my whole life. I did not think there was a woman living who would do otherwise, and say it so plainly, and not once ask me to admire her for it. I do not want your admiration." "I know," he said. "That is precisely the trouble." The words were out before his guard could close upon them, and they hung there in the cold air, too honest to be recalled. She turned fully toward him then. There was perhaps a foot of dust between them, and it might have been the width of a nation, and it might have been nothing at all. Her eyes searched his face in the failing light, and for once he let her, held still and let her look, let her go through the fine coat and the practiced eyes down to the poor frightened colonel. He had guarded 12 years behind a fortress no one had ever cared enough to lay siege to. He saw the moment she found something there. He saw her breath catch. She was not a woman who caught her breath, and it undid him more than any bolder thing could have. "We do not know one another," she said, very low, as though she were reasoning with herself and losing. "A fortnight married, and we do not know one another at all." "No," he agreed, "and yet I find I would give a great deal, more than I can well afford, to be known by you," which is a strange thing for a man to say who has spent his life ensuring he never should be. Her hand had come to rest upon the balustrade between them. His own lay a hair's breadth from it, and he watched his own fingers, as if they belonged to some braver man, close that hair's breadth until the side of his hand met the side of hers. Only that. The cool of her skin and the warmth beneath it, the small tremor she did not hide, the pulse he could feel or imagined he could feel racing at her wrist. He did not take her hand. To take it would have been to ask, and he had spent too many years being asked of to make the asking of her lightly. He only let his hand rest against hers in the dark, and she did not draw away, and the whole of the sky wheeled slowly over them while neither breathed. "Brannock," she said, his given name, for he had given her only that, no title, no house, nothing but the plain word a poor man might carry, and the sound of it in her mouth was worse and better than anything Odalis Larkspur had ever spent an evening constructing. "This is not what I bargained for." "Nor I," he murmured. "I bargained for peace. I appear to have contracted for something a great deal more dangerous." For a moment he thought she might close the last of the distance, or he might. The whole terrace held its breath with them, and then, with a discipline he recognized because it was the twin of his own, she drew her hand back, gently, not as a rebuke but as a woman setting down a thing precious to be handled carelessly, and pressed it flat against her own heart as if to still it. "I made one honest choice in my life," she said, unsteady now for the first time all evening. "I will not spoil it by pretending I do not feel what I feel, but I will not be a fool in the other direction either. I have no illusions, sir. I know what I married, and I know what the world will make of it, and I know that feeling is a luxury for people who can afford the fall. So," she drew a breath and put her dignity back on the way another woman might put on a cloak against the cold, "so we will go in, and we will be sensible. And I will thank you for the warm stone, and think of it more than I ought." She was 3 steps toward the house when Brannock, who had not run after anyone or anything in 12 guarded years, said her name. She stopped, but did not turn. "When I said I would give more than I can afford to be known by you," he said, to her back, to the pale line of her neck above the borrowed shawl, "I did not speak lightly, and I did not speak of money. There are things I have not told you. There is a matter I must set right, and soon, and when I have, I will ask you to hear it, all of it, and to judge me by it however you must." He heard the roughness in his own voice and let it stand. "Only do not decide in these next days that this was nothing, whatever comes. Whatever you learn of me, do not decide it was nothing, for it is the truest thing I have touched in longer than you have been alive to the world's cruelties." Now she did turn, and in the last of the light he saw that her composure had a crack in it after all, fine as a hair in porcelain, and that behind it was something young and hopeful she had not permitted herself in years. "You speak in riddles, Brannock." "I speak in the only truth I am at liberty to give you tonight," he said. "Forgive me the rest a little longer." She studied him. Whatever she saw, it was enough, for she inclined her head. That grave, level nod he was already learning to read as her whole heart offered in the smallest possible coin. "A little longer, then," she said. "But not much, sir. I have spent my life among people who kept their true faces in a drawer. I will not build anything upon a man who does the same, however warm his stone." And she went in, and the light of the doorway swallowed her, and Brannock stood alone on the terrace with his hand still cold, where hers had been, and the taste of ruin sweet in his mouth. He did not go in at once. He made himself look plainly at what he had done. He had gone out disguised to prove that no one could love the man beneath the Duke, and a woman had gone and loved the man, and now the Duke stood between them like a locked door to which only he held the key. And every hour he left it locked was an hour of the deception she had told him she would not forgive. He would tell her after the settlement business with her mother was safely broken, after Sir Hollis Marchmain was seen off, at a moment of his own careful choosing, gently, wholly on his knees if it came to that. He did not know that the choosing would not be his. He did not know that Odelys Larkspur, who forgot no slight and forgave none, had watched a plain nobody in mended slippers draw the Duke of Yvelden out onto a dark terrace, and had recognized, with the swift, terrible cleverness of the truly vain, that the man of no fortune Calantha had married, and the great Duke who owned half the North wore, beneath their tuhoots, one and the same face. Even now, in a lit room behind him, that knowledge was being turned over like a jewel, and priced and readied for the moment it would do the most harm. He knew only that he had touched her hand in the dark and been remade by it, and that a man remade is a man with everything at last to lose. The music inside swelled and turned to laughter. Brannock squared his shoulders, put the cold Duke's face back on over the warm poor man's heart, and went in to meet whatever waited, certain of one thing only, and it the most dangerous certainty of his life, that whatever it cost him, and it would cost him dearly, he was not going to let her go. The letter came with the morning post, and Brannock knew the hand before he broke the seal. He was standing in the low-ceilinged kitchen of the cottage he had let under the name of a plain man, his sleeves turned back, the fire he had built himself still catching, when the boy from the village brought it to the door. Calantha was at the well. He could hear the bucket knocking against the stone, and the small tune she hummed without knowing she hummed it, and for the length of one breath he wished, with a violence that frightened him, that the letter had gone astray in a ditch. But the seal was Odelys Larkspur's, the pressed sprig of larkspur she was so fond of, and beneath the wax the writing belonged to a man he had trusted for 11 years, Halloran, his own steward at Yvelden, who did not write to a pauper. Brannock read it standing, the paper held close to the poor light. The words were few, and they were a blade. Miss Larkspur, wrote Halloran, in evident distress, had come to the great house 3 days past, demanding audience with the Duke, being told his Grace was abroad on private business. She had grown insistent, had spoken of a man lodging near the chapel who wore a labourer's coat and a gentleman's hands, who quoted Latin over a mended fence and knew the price of a hunter to the guinea. She had put it about the county that this stranger was no honest poor man at all, but a fraud got up to prey on decent families, or worse, she had begun to say, a bailiff's spy, a thief studying the houses he meant to rob. She was bringing the magistrate, Mr. Prentice, to see the fellow examined. Halloran begged to know his master's wishes, for he did not know whether to laugh or to ride out and stop her, and he dared do neither without a word. The fire spat. Brannock folded the letter along its old creases and put it into the breast of his coat, over the place where it beat hardest, and stood very still. He had built this whole deception with his own 2 hands, as carefully as he had built the fire, and he had never once, until this moment, considered that it might burn the wrong person. The reason he had built it lived in him like an old wound that ached before rain. 9 years gone. There had been a woman, bright, laughing Rosanne, who had wept so prettily over his coming inheritance, who had loved the Duke of Yvelden with her whole heart until the week his elder brother recovered from the fever and the dukedom slid, for a season, out of Brannock's reach, and then had loved a viscount instead, and told Brannock so with the same soft mouth that had promised otherwise. His brother had died within the year regardless. The title had come to him after all, and with it the certainty, hard as a coin, that no woman living would ever again look at him and see the man before the rank, so he had learned to hide the rank. He had let his estates be run by men he trusted, had gone about the north in a plain coat calling himself by his mother's maiden name, and had watched, from behind that plainness, how people used a man they believed had nothing to give. And then Calantha Durrant had married that plain man to spite her mother, believing she was throwing herself away, and had been kind to him when kindness cost her everything and won her nothing. "You have gone grey as the ash," she said from the doorway. He turned. She stood with the dripping bucket, a strand of dark hair stuck to her cheek, her sleeves as turned back as his own, and she was looking at him with that steady, unflinching attention that had undone him by degrees these many weeks. The look of a woman who had learned young to read a face for storms. He made himself smile. "Halloran writes that the great house wants a hedger for the winter," he said, and hated the ease with which the lie came. "Wages and a dry loft. I am considering it. Then consider it aloud. And I shall tell you if you are being foolish." She set the bucket down and crossed to him and took his cold hand between her two warm ones without ceremony, chafing it, and he let her. Because he was weak, because the feel of her hands undid every resolution he had ever formed. "You are cold as a churchyard. What has frightened you, Brannock? And do not tell me hedging, for you have never in your life been frightened of honest work." He looked down at their joined hands. Hers were reddened at the knuckles from the well, and the washing she would not let him do though he tried. Her wedding ring was a thin band of pewter he had bought for $1 in the market at Harlow, because a gold one, he had judged, would have made her suspicious. He had half a mind, standing there, to put a ring worth more than the whole village on that finger. He had half a mind to say everything. "A man I knew in better days is coming to look for me," he said instead, which was true, every word of it, and cowardly in its truth. "It may be there will be trouble over it. If it comes to that, Calantha, if men come here asking after me, asking who I am, I need you to say only that you are my wife and that I am an honest man, and to say nothing else, and to let me answer for myself." Her hands went still around his. "Who are you then?" she said very quietly. "That men come asking? Your husband." He lifted her reddened knuckles to his mouth and pressed his lips there once and shut his eyes over it. "I am your husband, and I have never lied to you about the thing that matters. Believe that much, whatever else you hear. Can you?" She was silent a long moment. When he opened his eyes, she was watching him with something that was not quite doubt and not quite trust, but the ground where the two of them wrestle, and it wrung him worse than any accusation. "I believe," she said slowly, "that you are asking me to believe you without telling me why. My mother asked that of me my whole life. I found I could not." Then, seeing his face, she softened and pressed his hand once more before she let it go. "But you are not my mother." "I will hold my tongue, Brannock. I will say you are an honest man, because I have found you to be one, in every small thing where a false man would not have bothered. Only," and here her voice caught, and she mastered it, "only do not make a liar of me before Mr. Prentice. I have little enough in this world. I should like to keep my good word." She had named the magistrate. He had not. "Where did you hear that name?" he said. Colour came up her throat. "Odalys Larkspur came to the chapel yesterday, while you were at the coppice," she said. "She came in her carriage with the crest on the door, and she stood in the churchyard among the poor graves in her London silk, and she told me, before the sexton, before the curate's wife, before half of our Veldon village who had come to hear it, that she pitied me. That I had been so desperate to defy my mother that I had bound myself to a vagabond and a criminal. That the constable would have you in irons before Michaelmas, and that I would be left a beggar and a jest, and that it was no more than a girl deserved who had reached above her station and grasped at the first man who would take her." Her chin came up. "I told her that I had reached below my station, by every account in the county, and had found it the higher ground. She did not care for that. She left." He stared at her. Odalys had come to break her, and Calantha had stood in a pauper's churchyard in a mended gown and given Odalys Larkspur back her cruelty polished to a mirror, and had said nothing of it to him for a whole day and a night, rather than add to whatever she saw weighing on him. The tenderness that went through him then was so vast it was nearly grief. "You should have told me," he managed. You should have slept, she returned. You did not, either of us. I heard you at the window past midnight, looking at the road. She gathered up the bucket. So. There is trouble coming down that road, and it has my name and yours tangled in it, and you will not tell me its shape. Very well. I have been poor a long time, Brannock. Trouble is an old visitor. I will set another place and we will meet it fed. He caught her wrist. Calantha. Do not. Her voice shook, only once. Do not say a thing now that you would have to take back before the magistrate. I could not bear to be lied to gently. My mother lied to me gently for 20 years. If you must lie, lie plainly, so that I may at least despise it cleanly. She looked at him and her eyes were bright and dry by force. But I would rather you did not lie at all. The knock at the door came before he could answer, and it was the flat, official knock of a man who has knocked at many doors and been let into most of them. Brannock put Calantha behind him with one hand, a thing he had never done, a thing a plain hedger had no right to do, the reflex of a man accustomed to standing between danger and what he valued, and opened the door. Mr. Prentice the magistrate stood upon the step, stout and grave in a good black coat, his hat in his hands out of a countryman's courtesy that his errand did not warrant. Behind him, framed against the grey morning and her waiting carriage, stood Odalys Larkspur. And beside her a woman Brannock had never seen but knew at once for what she was, because Calantha's whole body had gone rigid at his back. A handsome, hard-faced woman in expensive mourning she was surely not entitled to, with Calantha's very eyes turned to flint. Mrs. Durrant, said the magistrate, and Brannock felt Calantha flinch at the name. Forgive the intrusion. I am Prentice of the Ivelden bench. I am given to understand that the man of this house passes himself under a name not his own, and lives among these good people under a false character. These ladies have laid an information. I am obliged to look into it. His eyes went to Brannock, not unkindly, but very shrewd. What is your name, sir? Brannock, he said. It was true. It was even if one went far enough back, his own. His mother's people had been called so. Brannock, and I am husband to this woman, and I have taken no man's purse, and no man's name that was not mine to take. He lies as easily as he breathes, said Odalys sweetly, coming forward. Mr. Prentice, look at his hands. Turn them over. Those are not a labourer's hands. And ask him where he learned his French and his Latin, and how a beggar comes to know the bloodlines of every hunter in the county. He is a gentleman fallen to ruin, or a gentleman feigning ruin, and either way he has practised a fraud upon this parish and upon this creature. Her lip curled toward Calantha, who was fool enough to be flattered by it. That creature, said the woman in mourning, in a low, carrying voice, is my daughter. She stepped up beside the magistrate and looked at Calantha over Brannock's shoulder with a possessive fury that made his hand tighten at his side. Calantha, you will come away from this man and this hovel and this shame you have heaped on my head, and you will come now. I have found you a match, Mr. Wexley, a respectable widower of 2,000 a year, who is knows why to overlook this squalid little marriage as the folly of a child, which the law may yet be brought to dissolve given cause. Her eyes flicked to the magistrate, cold and expectant. And here it seems is cause. Fraud voids consent. Does it not, Mr. Prentice? A woman cannot be bound to a man who wed her under a false name. The word went through Brannock like a spike of ice. He had never thought of it. He had made himself plain to test the world, and in his plainness he had used a name not fully his, and that carelessness, that small vanity of concealment, could be turned into the very lever to tear her from him. Fraud voids consent. If it were proved that he had wed her under a false character, the marriage might be unmade, and Calantha handed over to her mother, and to Wexley of 2,000 a year like a parcel returned for a fault in the direction. You would sell her, he said, and his voice came out of the place where the Duke of Ivelden lived, not the hedger, low and terrible, so that the magistrate's brows drew together and even Odalys took a small step back. You schemed to sell her to the highest bidder, and she fled that market and married a poor man to be free of you. And now that she has found something you cannot price, you come to void it. Madam, I would not give you a dog you meant to sell. Sir, said Prentice sharply, you will moderate yourself. Whatever else, there is a question of law here, and I must answer it. Is Brannock your true and only name? Yes or no? Take care, for I can send to the parish register and to the bishop's court, and the truth will out whether you speak it or hold your tongue. And there it was, the whole edifice trembling on a single word, and the truth crowding up behind his teeth like water behind a cracked wall. He had only to say it. He had only to say, I am Brannock, Duke of Ivolden, and I own the ground this magistrate stands on, and the church where I wed her, and half the roads Odoli's larkspur rode to shame her, and every accusation would collapse to dust, and the cruel woman would be exposed, and Calantha's mother would grovel, and no court in England would part him from his wife. He had only to say it, and lose forever the one certainty he had built his hidden life to find, that Calantha Durrant had loved a man with nothing. If he spoke, she would never again look at him and not see the dukedom. He would never know, he could never know, whether the woman who chafed his cold hands at the well would have chafed them still, had there been rubies on them. The very thing that had scarred him 9 years past reared up now and set its hand on his mouth. He turned. He looked at Calantha. She had come out from behind him. She stood in the doorway of the mean little cottage in her mended gown, between him and her mother, between the pewter ring on her hand and the 2,000 a year at the gate, and she was not looking at the magistrate, or at Odolis, or at the mother who would sell her. She was looking at Brannock, and her face was white and open and utterly without guile, and she said, before he could speak, in a clear voice that carried across the yard, his name is my husband. I do not care what else it is. She put her reddened hand flat against his chest, over the folded letter, over the hammering heart. I married a man with nothing, Mr. Prentice, of my own free will, in the sight of God and the curate and any who cared to witness, to be free of a woman who would trade me like a mare. If that marriage is fraud, then honesty is a thing I have never once been shown, and I will keep my fraud and thank you. Her eyes never left Brannock's. Whatever you are hiding, and you are hiding, I have known it a fortnight, it changes nothing I chose. Only tell me true. I have asked so little of you. Tell me true, now, before these people, and I will stand by it whatever it costs us both. But if you will not, and her voice broke at last, wholly, then let me go with my mother, for I cannot live beside a locked door. Her hand pressed harder over the letter, over the seal she could not see over the whole of it, and Brannock, Duke of Ivolden, who had feared one truth for 9 years and hidden behind a plain coat to escape it, understood in that instant that he had come to the one place his whole scheme could not save him, that the very silence he had built to protect his heart was the thing about to cost him hers, and that there was no longer any road left that did not run straight through the truth. The great hall of Ivolden had never felt so much like a courtroom, and Brannock stood in the thick of it with his plain coat and his borrowed name, watching the woman he had married be tried by people who did not know they stood in his house. Odolis Larkspur held the floor as she always did, her voice pitched to carry, a fan working slow at her throat as though the very air about Calantha offended her. You must forgive us our curiosity, she was saying, and the ring of silk-clad guests tightened by a half-step, hungry. A girl of no name, no dowry, no people worth the mentioning, wed in a fortnight to a man who cannot keep a decent coat on his back. One does wonder what the arrangement was. One does wonder who paid whom. Brannock felt the old cold thing wake in his chest, the reserve he had worn since his brother's grave, the armor he had built so that no one might see where he could still be wounded. He had come north in rags on a private wager with his own bitterness, meaning to learn at last whether a single soul in this county would treat a poor man as a man. He had found his answer in Calantha Durrant, who had shared her bread with a stranger and asked nothing. And he had married her under the name Bran the Joiner, and every hour since he had meant to tell her the truth, and every hour some coward part of him had held its tongue, terrified that once she knew. The clear-eyed way she looked at him would curdle into the looking he saw on every other face in this room. Now the truth was a stone in his throat, and Odolis was reaching for his wife with words like small knives. Speak, then, Odolis pressed, sweet as spoiled fruit. Tell the company what husband does. Tell them what he is. Calantha stood very straight in her mended grey, her chin level, and she did not flush and she did not beg. He is kind, she said, and her voice did not shake. He is honest in his work and gentle in his speech, and he has never once asked me to be less than I am. If that is a poor account to this company, then I fear the company keeps a poor ledger. A titter ran the ring, uncertain whether to be cruelty or admiration. Brannock's hands had closed into fists at his side. He had watched her bear this in the chapel weeks, bear it in the market, bear it at every table Ulis could contrive, and each time she had answered with that same unbending grace, and each time it had undone another lashing of the rope about his heart. He could not bear it a moment more. A poor ledger, Odalys repeated, and her laugh had an edge of iron in it now, for she was a woman who could suffer anything but being answered. How very fine. And yet fine words do not fill a larder, child, nor buy a gown that has not been turned twice. I would not shame you for your rags, no, no. I would only ask that you not carry them into rooms above your station. There are those of us who were bred to this hall. You wandered into it on a beggar's arm. She turned to the ring for the applause she had always been given, the practiced pause of a woman certain of her audience. One pities the creature truly, to think herself raised by a marriage that has only sunk her lower. Brannock had opened his mouth to end it, station or none, name or none. He had resolved in that instant to shed the whole disguise and let the county make of it what it would, if only to put himself between his wife and one more word. But the doors spared him the choosing, for they opened at the hall's far end, and Mr. Fenwick came through them. Brannock knew him at once, the steward of Ivolden, grey and stooped and 40 years in service to the house, who had been sent south a month gone on the estate's business and could not have known his master was playing the pauper in his own county. Fenwick came in travel-stained and weary, a folio of deeds beneath his arm, his eyes sweeping the hall for the man he served, and they found him. They found Brannock in his plain coat at the edge of the crowd, and the old steward stopped as though he had walked into a wall, and his face broke open with relief and confusion, and helplessly with reverence. "Your Grace," Fenwick said, into a silence that had gone suddenly total. He bowed deep, the bow of a lifetime's habit. "Forgive me, I did not know you were returned. The papers from the London courts are here, Your Grace, all signed, the Northern holdings entire." The word fell into the room like a bell struck in a crypt. "Your Grace, Your Grace." Brannock saw it travel from face to face, saw the smiles freeze and the fans still, saw Odalys Larkspur's painted composure crack down the centre like river ice in a thaw, and then he made himself look at Calantha. She had gone white. Not with the pretty faintness the other ladies affected, with something graver, a stillness that frightened him more than any weeping could have. Her eyes were on him, and in them he watched understanding arrive. The plain coat, the mended cuffs, the joiner's hands that had never quite been rough enough, the man she had chosen out of nothing but defiance and kindness, and he watched her understand that all of it had been a lie she had been handed like alms. "Say it is a mistake," she said, so low that perhaps only he could hear. "Bran. Say he has taken you for another man." He could not. He had spent his whole gorded life refusing to lie outright, only to hide, and the hiding had brought him here, to a face gonna ash before him. "Calantha," he said, and his voice was not the Duke's voice and not the joiner's, but only a man's, stripped bare. "It is no mistake." Odalys found her tongue first, because women like Odalys always did, and she found it in the wrong key entirely. "Your Grace," she cried, sweeping toward him in a rustle of silk, her fan forgotten, her face rearranging itself into rapture with a speed that turned his stomach. "Your Grace, forgive me, I had no notion. Had I but known— Oh, what a jest you have played on us all. What a marvellous jest." "It is no jest, madam." His voice cut across the hall, and now it was the Duke's voice, low and level and terrible, the voice men in 3 counties had learned to fear, and Odalys stopped as though she had run against a chain. Brannock let his gaze travel the whole shrinking ring of them, the flatterers and the tittering and the fine cruel faces that had spent the evening flaying his wife for sport, and he felt no triumph in it, only a cold and settling clarity. "You wished to know what I am," he said. "I am Brannock, Duke of Ivolden. This hall is mine. The land you crossed to reach it is mine, and the church where you were wed, madam, and the very living of the parson who married my wife and me. You have supped at my table tonight, and you have used my house to torment a woman worth 10 of your assembled number, and you did it believing her defenseless. That is the account this company keeps." He looked at Odalys, and she seemed to shrink an inch inside her gown. "You asked who paid whom." "No one paid, madam. She married a poor man, because she is the only soul in this county who did not first ask what he owned. You would not understand it. You have never once in your life looked at a person and not first counted their coin. The silence held a moment longer, brittle as spun sugar, and then it began to break in the worst way for Odalys, not in outrage, but in the small shifting sounds of her own allies drawing back from her, the half-step away, the averted eye, the whispered word behind a lifted glove. Brannock had watched courts and drawing rooms his whole life. He knew the exact instant a favourite became a liability, and he watched it wash over Odalys Larkspur now. Her mouth worked. No sweetness came. Her mother, who had schemed and simpered at her side all season, had gone the colour of tallow and taken a full pace toward the doors. "Your Grace, I only ever meant," Odalys began. "You will not address my wife again," Brannock said, "nor cross my land, nor sit at any table where she is welcomed. That is the whole of what you have won this evening, and it is more than you have earned." He turned from her as one turns from a thing already decided, and to the room he said only, "The hospitality of Yvelden is withdrawn. You will find your carriages." They went. Oh, they went quickly, that bright, cruel crowd, gathering their wraps and their wounded dignity, and Odalys Larkspur went among them stripped of every ally she had bought with flattery, a small diminishing figure in too much silk, and Brannock did not watch her go. He had eyes for one person only in all that emptying hall, and when at last he turned to find her, the place where Calantha had stood was empty too. His heart went ice. Calantha. He said her name to the room, and the room did not answer. He crossed to the spot where she had been, as though she might yet be found in the air there, and a footman by the side door, one of his own, one who had served the joiner supper not knowing him, stammered that the young mistress had gone out not a minute past, out through the garden door, out into the night without a cloak. Brannock did not stop for his own. He went through the garden door at a stride that became a run before he cleared the terrace, out into the raw northern dark where the wind came down off the moor with a knife in it, and the last of the day was a bruise on the western hills. Calantha. The formal gardens gave him nothing. The yew walks nothing, and a black dread rose in him that dwarfed every fear he had carried since his brother died, the dread of a man who has found the one thing he cannot live without only to feel it slipping through his fingers by his own long cowardice. He found her at the far end of the lower garden, where the clipped hedges gave way to the wild ground and a low gate opened onto the moor road, and she had her hand upon the gate as though she meant to walk the whole cold length of the county rather than spend another hour beneath his roof. The sight of her there, small against the enormous dark, her mended grey whipping about her in the wind, went through him like a blade. "Do not," he said, and stopped himself 3 paces off, afraid to close them without her leave. "Calantha, do not go, please." She turned. Her face in the last grey light was wet, and that was worse than all the rest, for he had never once seen this woman weep, not under Odalys's cruelty nor under the whole county's scorn, and now she wept for him. "You let me stand there," she said, and her voice broke on it. "Week upon week, you let me stand before those people and defend a poor joiner, and defend him gladly, because I thought I had found the one honest thing in a false world, and you were the falsest thing in it all along. A duke. A duke playing at want, wearing poverty like a costume to a mask, while I, hand pressed hard to her mouth, while I meant every word." "I know," he said. "God help me, I know it, and it is the whole of my shame. Was it a game?" The word cracked out of her. "Was I a curiosity? The clever poor girl, will she notice, will she not, a season's amusement for a bored great man? No." He said it with such force that the wind seemed to carry it out over the moor. "No, Calantha, hear me. If you hear nothing else, and then send me away forever, hear this." He took one step, and when she did not flee he took another, close enough now to see the tears track her cold cheek, close enough that his hands ached with not reaching for her. "I came north because I had buried my brother, and every soul who called on me after called on the title and not the man. They wept at his graveside and eyed his lands over their handkerchiefs. I grew hard. I stopped believing there was a person alive who would look at me and see a man where a fortune stood. And I made a bitter, foolish wager with my own bitterness, that I would go among people as no one, as nothing, and prove myself right, that not one heart would treat a pauper as though he mattered." The wind took a strand of her hair across her wet face. She did not move to loose it. She was listening, and it was the only mercy he had ever wanted. And then there was you, he said, and his own voice failed and steadied. You shared your supper with a stranger who could give you nothing. You defended me before people who could have ruined you for it. You married me, Calantha, a man with holes in his coat, to spite a scheming mother, and because your own true heart told you I was worth the choosing. You are the one person in all my life who chose the man because the man was all there was to choose. Do you understand what that is to a man who had stopped believing such a soul existed? I did not tell you because I could not bear to watch you become like the rest. It was cowardice, the lowest cowardice. But it was never a game. There was never a moment I did not mean it. I married you as truly as any man has ever married, and I would tear the title off like the coat if it would win me back the way you looked at me an hour ago. She was crying still, but differently now, and her hand had come away from the gate. All those weeks, she said, and it was not quite an accusation now, more the sound of a woman rebuilding the world from the ground. The chair you mended at the parsonage, the wall you set your shoulder to when the miller's cart threw its wheel. You did those things with your hands, Bran, I saw you. A duke does not know how to do those things. My brother taught me the joiner's craft when we were boys, he said. Our father thought it beneath us. My brother thought a man ought to be able to make one true thing with his own hands, whatever his name. It is the last of him I have left. I did not counterfeit that. I have never counterfeited anything with you but the coat on my back and the name I gave the parson, and I would give 10 years of my life to unsay both. You are the Duke of Ivolden, she said, as though testing whether the words could be true, and the rest be true also. I am the man you married, he said. The Duke is only what I own. You are what I have chosen. He held out his hand into the cold between them, palm up, offering and not seizing. The whole of his guarded heart lay open on it. I have said it all wrong and too late, and you have every right to walk through that gate. But I could not let you go without your knowing you were never a jest to me. You were the first true thing I had found in years. You were the only true thing. For a long moment there was only the wind, and the great dark house behind them spilling light onto the terrace, and her face turning the words over and over. And then, when he had begun to believe she would go, her cold fingers came to rest, trembling in his palm, not a surrender and not yet a yes, but a staying, a not leaving, the smallest possible mercy and the largest thing he had ever been given. He closed his hand about hers as though it were the one warm thing in the whole freezing north, and he began, at last and haltingly, to lead her out of the wind and back toward the light, everything still to be mended and nothing yet lost. And his heart racing ahead of them both toward the woman it had so nearly thrown away. The gravel of the chapel road tore at his boots, and Brannock did not slow. He had crossed half the north on horseback in a driving rain once, in a single night to bury his father, and he had felt less than he felt now, a hollow, roaring urgency that had no dignity in it and no care for who watched. Carriage stood in the yard beyond the lit gate, its lamps already lit against the failing afternoon, and a groom was handing up the small trunk that held everything Calantha Durrant owned in the world. She was reaching for the door. Calantha. Her name came out of him rough, unguarded, stripped of every title and every practiced restraint he had worn like armor since he was a boy of 19 who had learned what women could want from man who owned half a county. Do not get into that carriage. She turned. The wind had loosened a dark strand of hair against her cheek, and her eyes, those steady, unflinching eyes that had never once flattered him, never once brightened at the word Ivolden, because until an hour ago she had not known it belonged to him, met his and held. She did not run to him. That was not her way, and he loved her the more for it, though he had not yet said the word love aloud even to himself. Your Grace, she said. The two words landed like a closing door. I think you have said everything the occasion requires. You need not follow me out to say it more kindly. I have said nothing, he answered. I have stood in that chapel and let strangers do my speaking. I came out here to do my own. Behind him the chapel had emptied its scandalized, delighted crowd into the yard, Lady Merrow and the Fenwick sisters and all the Polished company who had come to see a pauper's bride shamed, and had instead seen a duke unmasked. He did not turn to look. Let them watch. He had spent 20 years arranging his life so that no one might ever see him want anything, and he found, standing on the wet gravel with his heart in his throat that he no longer cared who saw. "You lied to me," she said. It was not an accusation flung to wound. It was simply true, and she said it the way she said all true things, plainly, so that it could be answered, every hour of these 6 weeks. The man I stood beside at the altar, the man in the worn coat with the mended cuff who split kindling at the almshouse because the old women could not, that man does not exist. That man is the only part of me that has ever been real. He took a step nearer, and when she did not retreat he took another. Hear me, and then get into your carriage if you still wish to, and I will not stop it. I will send you where you please with means enough that your mother can never again sell you the highest bidder at a card table, that I owe you whether you forgive me or not. Her chin lifted a fraction. I did not marry you for means. I know it. His voice broke on it, and he let it break. God help me, that is the whole of it. That is why I could not tell you. Do you know what it is to be a man in my position? From the day my father died and left me the coronet, I have been a purse with a face on it. Women have looked at me the way a starving man looks at bread, Odalys Larkspur chief among them, who has courted my consequence in a dozen drawing rooms and never once looked at me at all. My uncle married for love, as he called it, and the woman he chose emptied the east wing of its silver and vanished by the second winter. I learned, young Calantha, that no one wanted Brannock, they wanted Ivalden, so I stopped being Brannock. I put him away like a coat gone out of fashion, and I wore the Duke instead, and I told myself it was the same thing. The groom had frozen with his hand on the carriage door. Calantha made a small motion, and he stepped back, and it was only the two of them again in the ring of watching faces. And then, Brannock went on, lower now for her alone. A friend wagered my temper that I could not pass a season unknown. A foolish thing, a young man's game played by a man too old for it. I went among the almshouse and the modest chapel where no one knew my face. In a coat I had not worn since I was poor in everything but land, and there was a woman bartered by her mother to escape her debts, and that woman looked at the shabby stranger they had found to marry her, a nobody with nothing, and she did not weep and she did not scheme. She squared her shoulders and said, his mouth curved despite everything, "If I must be given away like a parcel, I will at least choose the parcel's direction." And she chose me, the pauper. She chose the man because she would not be chosen for. Do you understand why I could not say a word? For the first time in 20 years I was wanted by someone who had every reason to want me gone. I could not bear to hand you the reason to look at me like all the rest. Calantha's composure, which had held through the chapel and the crowd and the unmasking, wavered at last, not into tears, but into something worse, a stillness so complete he thought he had lost her. "You let me pity you," she said, "in the almshouse. I gave you my own dinner that first week, because I thought you had none. I mended your cuff with thread I could not spare. You did." He could not speak above a whisper, and it was the richest I have ever been. The wind moved between them. Somewhere behind, a woman's laugh started and was quickly smothered, and he knew without turning that it was Odalys, discovering too late that cruelty aimed at a duchess-to-be was a very different thing from cruelty aimed at a pauper's wife. He did not spare her a glance. "I do not want your almshouse," Calantha said slowly. "I do not want the carriage, nor the coronet, nor the half of the north they say you own. I have wanted none of it, and I will tell you plainly, standing here where all these fine people can hear me, I do not want it now." She drew a breath. "I want to know one thing, and I want it answered as the man in the mended coat, not as his Grace of Ivelden. When you split that kindling, when you sat with old Mrs. Pardew and read her the psalms because her eyes had gone, were you playing a part? Was it a game to you, the whole of it?" No. The word came from the deepest ground in him. The lie was the coat and the name. Everything under it was the truest hour of my life. I read to Mrs. Pardew because I could not bear that no one else would. I split the kindling because you were carrying it yourself, and it made me angry, Calantha, that the world had left you to do it alone. I married you a stranger, and I have spent 6 weeks falling in love with my own wife across a breakfast table, hardly daring to touch your hand, terrified that if I loved you too openly you would see the man beneath and run. And now the man beneath is bare in front of you, and I find I am not terrified at all. I am only asking, stay, not as a duchess, as my wife, who happens also to be the only person alive who married Brannock and never once wanted Ivaldon. For a long moment she said nothing. The lamps of the carriage guttered. Then Calantha crossed the small distance between them herself. She came to him, which she had not done, and which undid him more than any word, and she reached up and laid her palm against the mended cuff of the coat he still wore. The poor man's coat he had put on that morning to be married in, because even that morning he had not been able to give it up. "You great fool," she said, and there was a wetness in her steady eyes at last, and it was not grief. "You might have simply told me. I would have loved a duke as readily as a pauper, provided he read the Psalms to Mrs. Pardew. It was never the coat I chose. It was the man who split the kindling. You have been the same man the whole while. You are only now brave enough to let me see all of him." He caught her hand where it lay against his sleeve and pressed it there, over his heart, which was beating hard enough that he knew she felt it. "Then you will not get in the carriage." "No," she said, "but I will have the trunk brought back in. It contains everything I own, and I find I am unwilling to lose it, now that I am to be so scandalously rich." A sound came out of him that he had not made in years, a laugh startled and real, and she smiled up at him. And for a moment the crowd and the chapel and the whole watching north fell away, and there was only Calantha Durrant, in a plain grey travelling gown, holding the heart of the Duke of Ivaldon in the flat of her ungloved hand. He turned then, at last, to the yard. They had gathered as such people always gather, near enough to hear, far enough to deny they had listened. Lady Merrow with her fan half raised, the Fenwick sisters, and in the front of them, because she had never once in her life understood when to withdraw, Audley's Larkspur, gowned in the ice-blue silk she had worn to outshine a bride she had come to mock, her lovely face gone the colour of tallow. "Your Grace," Audley's began, and her voice had found its drawing-room music again, all warmth and reproach. "How you have wronged us, letting us believe. Why, had we but known, none of us would ever have spoken a word amiss to dear Mrs. to the Duchess." She swept toward Calantha with her hands extended, the friend she had never been. "You must forgive a foolish jest among friends. We could not have dreamed—" "You knew her 3 weeks before you knew me," Brannock said. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. The yard had gone silent to hear it, and a quiet duke is a more fearful thing than a shouting one. "In those 3 weeks you called her a beggar in a borrowed bonnet. You upset her market-basket in this very yard and named it an accident. You told the Fenwick girls within her hearing that a woman who would marry a pauper deserved a pauper's grave. I heard you, madam. I stood behind you in the worn coat you did not trouble to look at, because you never look at anyone who cannot advance you." He let that settle. "You did not know she was a duchess. You knew she was poor. That was enough for you to be cruel, and it is enough for me to be done with you. You will not be received at Ivaldon, nor, I think, where the tale of this afternoon can travel, and I mean to see that it travels well." Audley's mouth opened and shut. No music came. She looked to Lady Merrow, who had discovered a sudden interest in the middle distance, and to the Fenwick sisters, who had shrunk behind their mother, and she understood at last, in the terrible arithmetic of her world, that she had spent her only coin on the wrong person and was now bankrupt before the whole of the county. She gathered her ice-blue skirts and fled to her carriage, and no one moved to stop her, and no one ever spoke of her at Ivaldon again except as a cautionary thing, the way one speaks of a hard winter survived. But Brannock had already turned back to his wife, for Audley's Larkspur had cost him enough of his life and would cost him no more of it. There remained one figure he could not dismiss so easily, and Calantha's eyes had gone to her already, a thin, overdressed woman at the chapel steps, Mrs. Durrant, who had gambled her daughter away and now saw, with dawning horror, precisely what she had thrown down at the card table. She started forward, all tremulous joy. "My darling girl, my clever, clever girl, did I not always say you would land well? Did I not always, mother?" Calantha did not raise her voice either. She was, Brannock thought, more truly her husband's match than she yet knew. "You did not say it. You sold me to a stranger to clear your debts, and you wept at the door of the chapel because you thought you had sold me cheap. I have not forgotten the price you named." She was quiet a moment. "The debts will be paid. Not because you are owed it, but because I will not begin my new life with a mother in a debtor's cell, and I will not have it said that the Duchess of Yvelden let her family starve. You will have a cottage on the western edge of the estate, and a living, and you will keep to it. You will not come to the great house unless you are sent for, and you will never again arrange anything for me, not so much as the seating of a dinner. Is that understood?" Brannock watched his wife's mother open-mouthed to bargain, for it was all she knew, and then close it, and drop at last into a curtsy that was 3 parts fear and 1 part something that might, in a smaller woman, have grown into shame. "Yes," Mrs. Durrant whispered. "Yes, your grace," and she withdrew, and it was mercy and it was justice both, and Brannock understood that his wife had managed in a single afternoon to be more than he had learned to be in 20 years of trying. "You are wasted as a duchess," he murmured, low as the yard began at last to disperse. "You ought to have had the coronet and the seat in the Lords and left me the kindling." "There is time yet," she said, "for you to teach me the Lords, and for me to teach you the Psalms. Mrs. Pardew tells me you stumble over the longer ones." And she smiled, and he thought he would spend the rest of his life arranging to be smiled at so. They were married again 3 weeks later, not because the first marriage lacked anything, for it did not, because Brannock could not bear that his wife's only wedding had been a shabby, defiant thing with her mother weeping at the door, and no one who loved her in the pews. This time the chapel was full of the people she had chosen, and not the people who had scorned her. The old women of the almshouse in their Sunday black. Mrs. Pardew led up the aisle on the Duke's own arm to the seat of honour, the groom who had frozen at the carriage door, now head of the Yvelden stables, the chaplain who had married them the first time, blinking at his sudden good fortune. Brannock stood at the altar in his proper coat at last and watched Calantha come toward him down the aisle in grey, for she had asked, and he had agreed, that she wear the same plain travelling gown she had nearly left him in, so that neither of them would forget how near it had been. And when she reached him he took her ungloved hand in both of his before all the county and did not care who saw how his own were shaking. Afterward, when the almshouse women had been feasted in the great hall that had not known laughter in a generation, and Mrs. Pardew had fallen asleep contented by the fire, and the last carriage had rattled off into the northern dark, Brannock found his wife at the tall library window with a single candle, looking out over the fields that ran, as the county said, half the breadth of the north before they met another man's land. He came and stood behind her and drew her back against him, and she let him, and for a while neither of them spoke. "It is a great deal of land," she said at last, "for a man who split kindling because a woman was carrying it herself. It is only land." He rested his chin against her hair. "I have owned it my whole life, and it never once kept me warm. You gave me your dinner in an almshouse when you thought I had none, and I have been warm ever since." He turned her gently so that he might see her face in the candlelight, the plain, dear, unflaring face that had chosen the nothing over the fortune and, in doing so, given him back the man he had buried at 19. "I spent 20 years certain that no one would ever want Brannock, and you never wanted anyone else." She reached up and touched the corner of his mouth where the old guardedness used to live and had, he realized, entirely gone. "Then take him to bed, your grace," she said softly, "and let the north keep itself till morning." He blew out the candle, and in the great house that had stood cold and watchful over half the north for 300 years, the Duke of Yvelden gathered the woman everyone had overlooked into his arms as though she were the whole of his inheritance and the land beyond the window nothing at all, which was precisely the truth of it, and the old house, for the first time in longer than anyone living could remember, seemed at last to have someone worth keeping in it.